Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Temitope Fagbemi. Our top story on this edition of the program is that U.S. President Barack Obama has announced efforts to normalize relations with Cuba after an embargo of more than 50 years. Cuba and the United States moved on Wednesday, December the 17th, to end decades of hostility by restoring diplomatic relations which were cut more than 50 years ago. The shift made possible the release of U.S. prisoner Alan Gross, who had been imprisoned for 5 years. Announcing the end of what he called a rigid policy of isolation of Cuba that had been ineffective, U.S. President Barack Obama said the United States would move towards normal ties and would open an embassy in Cuba.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
The United States also freed 3 Cuban intelligence agents held in the United States. While Washington's economic embargo on the island communist nation still stands for now, the announcements in many ways draw the curtain on a political saga that has spanned the Cold War and survived U.S. enmity, CIA assassination attempts, and the demise of Soviet communism. South American leaders welcomed the move by the United States and Cuba, hailing Pope Francis' role in ending more than 50 years of hostility. Today is Pope Francis' birthday, the Argentine Pope. He had an important role in mediation, recognized by Raul Castro today. Today we celebrate this result, not just Argentines, but also South Americans, Latin Americans. This should be celebrated the world over, because when you introduce a culture of dialogue, blockades end, as well as outrageous economic sanctions. To the countries, it is a triumph for all people of the world.
This news is very positive. Normalize their bilateral relations. In that regard, I heartily welcome today's development. I sincerely hope that these measures, this announcement, will help to expand further the exchanges between the two peoples who have been separated quite a long time.
However, Cuban dissidents reacted with reservations. Prominent dissident Yahoni Sanchez tweeted that Raul and Fidel Castro had won. Cuba and the United States have been ideological foes since the 1959 revolution that brought Raul Castro's older brother, Fidel, to power. Washington broke diplomatic relations with Havana in 1961, and the United States has maintained its trade embargo on the island, 90 miles south of Florida, for more than 50 years. But some critics of this move by the U.S. president say Mr. Obama is overreaching his authority and that Congress can overrule him. My colleague at the Voice of America, Caroline Persutti, looks at the legislative obstacles that may stand in the way of normal relations with Cuba.
Hope fills the streets of Cuba's capital as residents hear about President Obama's plan to restore relations with Cuba. Abiel San Miguel owns a restaurant in Havana.
I am happy. I hope this will be the beginning of the end of illogical things, which have no reason to exist and which have been shown to be obsolete.
But there are differing opinions at a Cuban neighborhood in Florida.
Obama making all the concessions, and what are we getting from the Castro?
Change could come to Cuba, but not quickly. It will take time for the State Department to review Cuba's designation as a terrorist sponsor. Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson.
We have to look at whether they have renounced the use of terrorism. We have to look at their ratification of international instruments against terrorism.
Next, the president can ease some financial restrictions, but constitutionally he cannot lift the trade embargo that dates back to the 1960s. Mike Gonzalez spoke via Skype from the Heritage Foundation.
The embargo, in other words, can only be changed and amended by the Congress. Mr. Obama, the executive, has no legislative powers.
All 6 Cuban-American members of Congress, regardless of political affiliation, oppose the president's proposals. Carl Meacham from the Center for Strategic and International Studies says that disapproval also could extend to diplomatic measures, with the president's plan to open a U.S. embassy in Cuba. Senators could refuse to confirm the ambassador, and
the Congress funds these embassies, funds the government. So, will these senators be okay with the funding of an embassy, or will they oppose that?
Restoring a diplomatic relationship with Cuba is constitutionally the president's right. But Congress carries the power of the purse and could refuse to fund anything that he proposes.
No doubt there may be obstacles on the path of President Obama to normalize relations with Cuba, but my guest on the program, Dr. Adetokunbo Pierce, believes it can be done, and both countries, that is the United States and Cuba, will benefit from this new friendship. How come the U.S. and Cuba have had such a hostile relationship in the last 50 years?
This is a hangover from the Cold War years. You remember that in 1959, when Cuba became independent, it opted for a socialist revolution. Actually, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro led this revolution, and they overthrew a capitalist regime. I believe it was Batista. And so you have a socialist country right next to the United States of America in the years when it was virtually a crime to be a socialist government. So they've been at war since then.
But when you look at it, Cuba still has issues of human rights. You can't actually say it's a full-fledged democracy. So what could be responsible for the newfound love between the two countries now?
Well, things have changed in Cuba as well as in the United States. Cuba is not as hard-lined as it used to be. Okay. You know, in 1962, when they had the Bay of Pigs incident, that was because Cuba was so close to Russia, actually provided its country as a launching base for Russia. So you had missiles being placed in Cuba right next to the American border. So those were the days when tensions were so high, when there was this Cold War atmosphere. That's not the case now. For the last few years, since the younger Castro took over government, there's been a more lenient, a more liberal, a more democratic type of atmosphere in Cuba. So with all of that, and giving the presidency of Barack Obama, who wants to be known as liberal, this can now happen.
Now, there's this belief that Fidel Castro, that's the older president now, that it was because of his hard stance that actually made relations between Cuba and the United States impossible. It is believed that it was an enemy. Fidel Castro now, as a president, was an enemy of the United States. How true is that?
Well, Fidel Castro was, when he was president, and still is, a hardline socialist, okay, and had this personal resentment of the American system. Don't forget that Castro is a product of the old times, the Cold War years, when communism and capitalism were at war. And so Castro led efforts to socialize Africa, for instance, different countries in Africa, and Castro never had any respect for the capitalist system, which is the American system. So it was not just Castro, it was the policies, but particularly Fidel Castro, because of his stance, coming from way back in the 60s, from his confrontation with John Kennedy, throughout the years to the time of his retirement.
But one thing baffles me. If the United States could have a relationship with Russia, why was a relationship with Cuba so impossible before this new deal came into place?
Well, it was just a matter of time. Russia had Gorbachev. Gorbachev was democratizing Russia, and Russia was opening up with the days of Reagan as president of America and Gorbachev president of Russia. So things began to kind of ease off between the two countries during those periods in the 90s. So in the 80s, leading up to the fall of the Soviet Republic in 1991, I believe. So things had changed between Russia and the United States based on the presidency of Gorbachev in Russia. But you never had a Gorbachev in Cuba. You have Fidel Castro, the old man from the 50s who still maintained that socialist hard line. So it took a while. It took a while. But you know, since Russia, the Russian Republic became, is no more, gradually Cuba itself began to change. After Russia, Cuba began to ally itself with Venezuela. Okay. Venezuela is virtually gone bankrupt. Therefore, Cuba has nowhere else to go but to begin to change its ways gradually. And with pressure from immigrants from Cuba into the United States, over the years things have changed. And this development now, which has eased off relationship between Cuba and the United States, it's a good development.
So what effect will this new deal have on Cuba and the whole of Latin America?
Well, first on Cuba, the setting up of an American embassy in Cuba will begin gradually to make Cuba more democratic, more liberal, more open. And the capitalist system is very attractive. Liberal capitalism very attractive because it gives room for expression, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. So it will change Cuba, but it will also change the United States, because the United States, I understand that life expectancy in Cuba is higher than in the United States.
Oh, really?
That's because the medical system, the free medical health system in Cuba, far more effective than in the United States, where medicine and the health issue is always a challenge. So both stand to benefit, I think.
Well, now, this new deal, what effect will it have on U.S. fugitives who have sought asylum in Cuba?
Well, they're working out the deal right now. Fugitives have been exchanged for, other people in the United States who are also seeking asylum in the United States. So there'll be an exchange, and gradually people will be able to travel back and forth. They will have they will harmonize the legal systems so that you will not be able to hide in any of those countries anymore. So,
well, the U.S. sanctions on Cuba, economic sanctions, now they are still in place. President Obama needs the approval of Congress.
It's a problem because the American Congress now is largely Republican. In fact, I understand that this is the first time since the 40s, or maybe more than that, that you've had so many Democrats leaving office, leaving the Senate, and so it may be a challenge because the Republicans are hard on socialism, hard on communism, and they may not be as lenient and as friendly as Obama has been. So it's still an ongoing issue. As I think Obama himself put it, it's a process, not an event. You know, it's ongoing.
It's ongoing, so is it sustainable? That's my final question.
So long as you open up communication, and so long as you act in good faith, and you know, there's been so much tension between the two countries. People have suffered a lot. Families been broken up. I remember one case of a child that was being tossed from America to Cuba, until the government of Cuba stepped in and eventually took the child. In the meantime, the parent is in America. Such things should not be allowed to happen. So it will be sustainable because it's ongoing, and it's in everybody's interest. Eventually, even the Republicans that are so hard on Cuba may have to reconsider this economic sanction.
Coming up after the break, intense sorrow and anger in Pakistan after over 100 school children were killed in a militant attack. Please stay with us.